thought shows that any strict and pedantic acquiescence to all instructions at all times is impossible. That's to say, any feeling which makes that insistence will be met with resistance. We're told not to lie, we are told to love our neighbours ourselves. Thus, if a man is running away from a gang of thugs and chooses to hide from them behind a large recycling bin, upon being asked by the gang, have you seen where that lad went? Better that I lie and say no, rather than tell the truth and put the lad in a position of receiving a beating. Of course, there are other things I could do to try and appease the situation, but the point still remains: does anyone think that turning the other cheek means that if a man tried to punch me out of the way in order to mug an old lady, that I should turn the other cheek? Of course not. Does turning the other cheek mean that a mother should let her young son strike out at her every time his impulses told him to do so? Absolutely not. It's not difficult to see how irrational this view is. Thus, we find that we cannot defend the pacifist position on biblical instruction. As I've said earlier, there's no collective assumptions to be made on this point. One must always work at an individual level, which can, of course, include regard for a large group of individuals. To argue a case that the Iraq War was justified, we must argue with regard to the group of individuals that make up the whole populace of Iraqi citizens, at least insofar as we do not simply lump them all together as a homogeneous group. As Christ did not say to the Roman centurion, did he? He didn't say down tools and give up that way of life. I am supposing that there remains an understanding between creature and creator, that military services are necessary. In fact, it seems to imply that they will be necessary, and it's easy to see why. I hope all this has led you, the reader, and myself, the author, to a position where we can agree that a wholly pacifist position is not to be encouraged, and that neither the Bible nor the moral law nor our own reason and intuition encourages or permits it. There is, of course, no automatic correlation between the position of the pacifist and non-pacifist as regards subjects like bravery, courage, morality and solicitude, for there will be many pacifists who have all four qualities in greater abundance than the majority of non-pacifists. But there will be times when the pacifist position prevents a man from acting in a way that can benefit others beyond his immediate purview. There will be times when we're called to briefly disregard Christ's claims to turn the other cheek in order that we prevent a more horrific act of violence or misery or suffering. We're called to use our common sense in order that we can live for him and glorify his name. Of course, this position does not immediately imply a justification in supporting the Iraq War. After all, there are many wars which are not easily justifiable by these principles or under these premises. All I've hoped to do in this piece is to show that some wars can be supported, and that sometimes it is our duty to support them. War is unpleasant and should be avoided whenever possible, of course, and so long as avoiding it does not mean an immoral action or a continuance of human suffering. But pacifism is wrong, make no mistake about that. The whole vocabulary of human sway is against the pacifist. Now, of course, my reasons for supporting the Iraq War are not simply the result of my being against pacifism. There are better reasons why I think the war was both necessary and just. I'm about to explain what they are, and in doing so, I feel that when I pay the greatest regard to factual basis, to the strongest train of reason, to the heftiest weight of authority, and from those who have either served in Iraq or experienced it as a citizen, I feel that the whole vocabulary of human sway would be on my side too, if they could resist for a moment the anti-war propaganda and the psychological demagogy which pollutes our air. The central reason why so many people think the Iraq War was unjust and unnecessary is very obviously because the media have tried to edge them towards thinking that way for a long time now. But if you think back carefully to the time just before the invasion in 2003, when the press really did think that weapons of mass destruction would be found, you would be aware that many of the newspapers were actually all for the invasion. The reality about media control is that it fully internalises the assumptions of the consensus. But this means nothing without the question, how can each of us, the individual, counter that? Well, we certainly owe it to ourselves to give ourselves the best chance of sound conclusions. Thus we must be wary of those who wish to get us on their side even before the case has been made. The very obvious way to avoid all gullibility, of course, is to realise that the press very often attempt to tell you what it wants you to think, and worse, actually, sometimes how it wants you to think. And we can see how easy it is that they can manipulate people, for example, through opinion polls. It's quite well known, actually, in government circles, how people in government can conduct a poll with questions directed towards getting the answer they require. So, for example, let's say that the government wanted a poll to show that the introduction of ID cards was favoured by the electorate. It would largely depend, of course, on the grammar and tenor of the questions by those conducting the poll. So, if they wanted to show that people were in favour, they would ask questions like, are you worried about thuggery, unruly behaviour and lack of discipline in our country? Yes. Are you worried that immigration is spiralling out of control? Yes. Are you concerned by the threat of terrorism in our country? Yes. Do you think the police should have more power to arrest unruly citizens? Yes. So, are you in favour of ID cards? Yes. Now, if they wanted the polls to reflect a feeling opposite to that one, they would have to phrase the questions in a different way, of course. If they wanted a no answer to ID cards, they would say, are you worried about the rate at which the government is keen to interfere in our personal business? Yes. Do you think the government infringes on our civil liberties too much? Yes. Do you think it is the right of the citizen to vote on matters such as ID cards? Yes. Do you think the Home Office wastes money which could be spent on more important things like getting more police officers on the streets? Yes. Are you for or against the introduction of ID cards? Against. That's a very simple example of manipulation, a very plain way of seeing the susceptibility of the human mind. The second poll would almost always give you a majority no, the first almost always a majority yes. The poll would have been conducted for that reason, to get the majority they wanted. I mean, this is not, of course, a definitive method of convincing you not to believe the intense sway of media opinion. Very often it's right, but one must be careful not to get windswept by popular opinion, such as the widely held belief, say, that Iraq was more stable before we intervened in 2003. Whenever you hear someone say this, you know straight away that they paid no attention to Iraq before our news reporters were stationed out there in 2003. The reality of the situation is that there wasn't much media interest before we sent our troops there. So naturally, if no one is reporting anything there, it's bound to feel like it was stable. But the truth is very different, and you don't have to look very hard to get a true account of what life was like under Saddam's regime before we intervened. Therefore, it's nonsense to say that Iraq would be stable. They say it would be stable, cruel but stable, of course, but if we left it alone. The very reason it's in this state is because it had been left to rot in the hands of a cruel dictator. We should have done more in '91, of course. Our error was a very costly error. We were already faced with a grim Hobbesian collapse of a society which would have eventually led to an intervention, but not from democratic countries like ours and the US.